Hey guys, I'm Casey Koelsch. Hope you're doing well, staying at home. I know that I am really actually enjoying some of the staying at home. Uh, the business on the top and PJ party on the bottom is a lot of fun. Hope you're enjoying your Sunday and still in your PJs for that matter. While we're talking today, I encourage you to make some notes. Any questions that you might have, thoughts you have, or maybe any uh, things that you hear that are not super clear. And then afterwards, we can talk. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So today, I am going to talk to you about one of my very favorite topics, React. So why would I even want to talk to you about React? You might be thinking, maybe not, maybe you already know. But I've been in software development for about 5 years now. Before that, I was an educator. I was a teacher. I actually had been involved in technology and loved it, but just I didn't know how to code or anything. And when it was time for me to move on from education and I wanted to do something different, I thought, what is it that I do that I'm super passionate about? And it was building websites, but I didn't code them. I just did websites, the drag and drop kind. And so I wanted to learn how to code, but I didn't want to just do websites. I also wanted to build applications, like full-on software and products. And when I learned about front end, I was like, yes, this is for me. I don't really have a design background, but at the time, front end was just kind of starting to be a thing. The coast started to have front end jobs. Oklahoma was a little bit behind, so there wasn't a whole lot, but I knew that it was the thing I wanted to do. So I did a boot camp, taught myself how to do front end JavaScript, and I actually was learning some Angular then, and I was really blessed to get a job internship, and then pretty quickly moved into product. At that time, I was working on some legacy product that they had. We were moving it from Flash to HTML5. So I was doing a lot of HTML, a lot of CSS, JavaScript, jQuery, but I wasn't really doing what the cool kids were doing. So when I got my next job, I had a boss that was believed in me quite a bit, and he came to me and said, Casey, what do you think? What should we build this application that is going to change the whole company? What are we going to build it in? I think React, but Casey, what do you think? And I was like, definitely React, which is kind of funny because I had absolutely no experience in React, never done it, barely read about it, but all for jumping in the deep end. I was like, let's do this. And I want to tell you my reasons for why did I want to do React specifically. One of my first reasons, which might be one of the reasons you're here listening at this, is a little bit selfish, but my career. So according to Hacker News, hiring trends, React completed the last 3 years as the #1 tech stack. You see here the percentages of the hiring posts related to each stack, and the last 3 years, React is on top. Glassdoor average salary for React developers as of March 2020 in the US was $76,929. Not too bad when you're coming from education, sad to say. So I wanted to learn how to do React for my career, but also it was huge. It was gaining huge popularity at the time and still is. According to the 2019 State of JavaScript survey, the 3 JavaScript-based tools are the most wanted by software developers, and React tops that by 21.5% as the most loved front-end tool. Estimated number of 8,064 industry leaders are currently using React.js. Among some of the most powerful are Airbnb, Uber, Netflix, Instagram, WhatsApp, BBC, Twitter, and Reddit. Since its release to open source in 2013, the React community has increased to 22,930 people, whereas 13,834 developers claim that they prefer AngularJS, and 8,017 use Vue, according to StackShare. So that's a lot of love for React. But kind of a funny story, React didn't actually start out as very loved. So we know Facebook is the ones who created React. Back in 2010, we start seeing some of the very first signs of React. Facebook introduced XHP into its stack, into its PHP stack, and they open sourced it. XHP allowed for creating composite components. They introduced this syntax later for React. The components are very important to the React. So in 2011, we see an early prototype of React by Jordan Walk. He created the Facts.js, and he created it to ship a search element on Facebook, actually the autocomplete that we still use with when you type in somebody's name and you kind of get some suggestions, right? In 2012, something new really started at Facebook. They acquired Instagram. Now, so this is when Pete Hutt came onto the scene. Now, Pete Hutt worked primarily on Facebook video, but also on Facebook photos. It was a very small team, and he was the primary developer on that when Instagram came in. And Instagram, they were a small startup compared to Facebook, and they ran themselves like a startup. Instagram was primarily mobile. I don't know if you guys remember back in the day when Instagram first started, they really didn't have a website. They were just on mobile. And so one of the things that Instagram and Pete were trying to tackle together is a website. And so Pete went to the front end engineering team there at Facebook and says, hey, what do you guys have for client-side rendering? Do you guys have any things that will take care of client-side rendering? And they actually had a few, but one of the things that they did have was React that Jordan built. And he had worked on this prototype kind of in his spare time. And it kind of got a little bit more legs when Facebook ads were having a hard time, and they also needed a client-side rendering. So they also started picking up React. But Pete really picked up React, and working with the Instagram guys, he was really pushing for it to get more ground. Also in 2012, and about September, Mark Zuckerberg announced, our biggest mistake was betting too much on HTML5, and he promised that Facebook would deliver a better mobile experience. And at the time, most of their traffic was all on the web, so it didn't quite seem like the right thing, but it actually paid off. We know that now. It paid off quite a bit for them to be very mobile focused, right? So then we get to 2013. React is open sourced, and oddly enough, it wasn't actually very well received. I think it was kind of a bad PR move in the way they announced it. And so people were more like, why do we need this? Why does it matter? They didn't really like it at first. But by the end of the year, React and JSX was available on Ruby on Rails as well as Python. And then towards the end of the year, Pete actually gave another talk where he talked about rethinking best practices. And that really started turning things around. People started looking at it and saying, hey, maybe this is actually something to pay attention to. Through 2014, React had a lot of growth. But then it wasn't until 2015 where React actually released its stable releases. And that's when Netflix started taking notice and Airbnb started adopting React. So now we're at 2016 where React starts going more mainstream. We have things like Redux, we have React Native where you can do React on iOS and Android. And then even in the most recent years, they've continued to do so much development. We have React hooks, which I highly suggest you take a look at because React hooks makes your life so much easier. So I've talked about all these things, but let's go back a bit. What exactly is React.js? It's an open source JavaScript library under an MIT license. Being a JavaScript library, React.js is just written in JavaScript. So having a little bit of background in JavaScript is definitely a must. If you want to be really good at React, definitely learn your JavaScript. It's a very highly declarative and component-based high-performance platform. I love this word declarative. One of my very favorite courses is taught by Tyler McGinnis. Highly suggest that you watch his video about declarative versus imperative programming. So this is what he says. Imperative programming is like how you do something, and declarative programming is more like what you do. So picture this. You've decided that you've been spending way too much time arguing about JavaScript fatigue. And your husband deserves a nice date. So you choose to go to Red Lobster since you've been listening to a lot of Beyonce lately. You arrive at Red Lobster and you approach the front desk and you say this in an imperative approach. You say, I see that table located under the Gone Fishing sign is empty. My husband and I are going to walk over there and sit down. Or you could take a declarative approach. You could say, table for two, please. The imperative approach is concerned with how you're actually going to get to the seat. You need to list out the steps to be able to show how you're going to get there. The declarative approach is more concerned about what you want, a table for two. So you can see how that could be a benefit, right? React is also component-based. We'll talk more about components, but having it component-based helps us to be able to reuse code and keep code isolated from more changes that need to go on. And it's also used for interactive and responsive user interfaces of websites and web apps, as well as iOS native and Android apps. You can even run it server-side if you want to by using Node. So I know I said I was going to talk a little bit about components. Let's go back. What exactly is a React component? Components are independent and reusable bits of code. They serve the same purpose as JavaScript functions, but work in isolation and returns HTML via a render function. So here you see this app, right, which is going to be our parent main component, and then it has smaller, what we call children components, a component form, a comment list, sorry, not component, a comment form, a comment list, and comments. They would break down into smaller components. Now, when it says it returns HTML via render function, we're not actually writing HTML in our JavaScript. We're actually writing something called JSX, which is then translated with our render function into the browser and actually becomes the HTML that you see. Here is an example in code of what you might see with a component. We have this component called intro. One of the reasons we know it's a component is because we capitalized it. Capitalizing your components is smart. And here you can tell this is just a JavaScript arrow function, and it's returning what looks like HTML. It's paragraph tags, and it says, hi there. So that's actually JSX, but then the browser is going to be translated, and the browser is going to understand it as HTML. So this component here is a paragraph that says, hi there. This component is actually what we would call functional or stateless. We also have class components. What's the difference between a stateless, or also called functional component, and class components? Functional components are functional because they're basically functions. They're JavaScript functions that we're writing. They're considered stateless because they don't hold or manage any state. We're going to talk a little bit more about state, but for this, just know that it means they're basically dumb components. They're presentational because all they do is output UI elements, what some people might call the pretty stuff. Then we have class components. They are class because they're basically classes. This is where some background in JavaScript and programming would come very helpful. They are smart because they contain logic. In the past, most of our apps would have a lot of the logic on the server side, but now we're moving progressively more and more logic over to the client side or into the browser. And you can do things like even routing from the browser in React. They are stateful because they hold or manage the local state. They're smart. And they're containers because they usually, not always, but usually will hold and contain numerous other components, mostly the functional components. They're usually the parents, and the functional components are usually the children, we would call it. Here's some examples. We have a stateless component and a class component. Here you see the same one we saw earlier. It's just an arrow function and returns a paragraph that says, hi there. Then on the other side, we have our class component. Here we have one method inside our class component called the render function. And this function inside returns, again, our paragraph that says, hi there. So at a basic level, they're not too much different, but they do serve different purposes. Let's talk a little bit about props and state. I know I talked about state a little bit earlier, but we're going to add props in. Props are read-only, and they can't be modified. Once the components render to the page, they don't change. Now, state changes, and state can be asynchronous. State can also be modified using this .setState, or if you're in hooks, you would use the useState hook. So let's take this sign-in modal that you might see as an example. So you can see where it says it has 2 lines, 2 inputs, your email and your password. That line and that text are the same font, same color, same length. I can use a reusable component there, but one says your email, one says your password. Those would be props, because once the page loads, those are not going to change. You're going to actually type, those are the placeholders. Placeholders wouldn't change. You're actually going to type in those. And now as you type and actually put your email in and your password in, those keystrokes are changing the input value for those. And that we would save into state, because that is changing as the user is interacting with them. I really love this diagram here of the data flow for React. The components can either be passed down as props, or they can materialize their own state and manage it over time. So they can either have props, but it's not either or. They can have both, but they can have props and they can have state. And you can see here, we have like a component at the top. That's like our parent component. It can receive props, and then it can pass those props down to their children, right? But the state, you notice, has the circle. State stays in the component itself, and the state is managed inside the component functions. Let's take a look at some code. Here we have we're talking about props here. I have a function called welcome, which is my component, and it's receiving some props. It's going to return an H1 that says hello, and then you see in the brackets, you see props.name. Then you have at the bottom where we're going to actually render our component, we have that welcome component there, and then it says name equals Sarah. Right there is where I'm putting my props, and I'm going to pass that down to my welcome function component, and it's going to render there. So what actually comes out on the page is going to say, hello, Sarah. Now let's take a look at state. This gets a little bit more overwhelming, but don't worry, it's not bad. This is a clock component. So we're going to render it on the page with the date and time, which, like you would think a clock, it would update as you're watching it. So this class component has 2 methods. It has a constructor and a render method. In our constructor, we have our props, and then you can see the line that says this.state equals date, new date. That's just JavaScript for the new date. Then in our render function, we're returning a div with an h1 that says hello world and an h2 that says it is this.state.date.to local time string. So it's pulling out the date from that state and displaying it in the local time. So this is going to, inside its component, it's going to update the state. So I've used the word render a few times. So how do I actually render that component on the page? So we see here, we see React DOM.render. It's a method in React, and I'm going to take the app that I just built, my app component, and I'm using, this is just straight JavaScript right here, document.getElement by ID at the root. And then over here in my index HTML, straight HTML page, I have a div with the ID root, and React is going to take that div and render my app in it. So that's how it gets on the page. So you might be thinking, okay, now what? There's a whole lot of stuff about React and so much to learn, but it's fun, I promise. I'm going to give you some helpful tips of things that I would do next. I would start looking at Create React App. Create React App is a boilerplate that Facebook has created. React does have a whole lot of dependencies and things that you need to do to get it up and running, but React App will take care of all that for you so that you can get your app up and running really quickly. Some other than the awesome resources with freeCodeCamp, some other things I suggest that I use is Medium. There are so many free blog tutorials out there that are really, really good. I really like Udemy, and Treehouse is one of the places where I learned a lot of my skills. Some of the people that follow and pay attention to in the React community, Dave Abramov is the one who created Redux, and he has a lot of great React resources. And like I said before, Tyler McGinnis is by far, I will say, one of the best React courses that I've ever taken. I'm not affiliated with any of these things. These are just things that I've used over time. I'm going to also put a handout in the Slack channel for freeCodeCamp where you can get this PowerPoint as well as the links that I've talked about throughout the time. And then I'm also going to, after this, we'll talk questions and answers. Well, thank you guys so much for watching. Again, I'm Cassie Koelsch. I am a software engineer leading the front end team at Anodix. My handle is at Cassie Koelsch. You can find me in Twitter, Slack, GitHub, pretty much anywhere you have a handle. So please reach out to me. I'd love to connect with you. And thanks so much for watching.